everyone, Clio here, and today I'm going to give you a book talk about a book that I recently read, which is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Now, usually these book talks are very informal get-together talks in which I abandon all hope for structuring them, but I'm going to actually try to structure this one a little bit more. So I'm going to start off with a general introduction into the story, so a general plot premise for this book in particular. Going to go into historical context at that point, and then I'm going to dive into the book and divide that discussion mainly among two parts, because this is very much a book that makes major shifts along the midway point. So I'm going to be discussing those two parts more or less separately. Now, first off, before you dive into this book, some things that you do need to know is that it has, first of all, a lot of trigger warnings. This is very much a ruthless book, a cruel book in which a lot of atrocious events will be taking place. And so we're not just looking at cruelties of war, which is definitely what is mostly stressed out in this book, but we're also looking at self-harming content, amongst other things, at abusive relationship to drugs and things like that. So do be wary that there are a lot of trigger warnings with going into this book. Apart from that, what also needs to be known, it is very much a polarizing book. There are a lot of people who hate it, there are a lot of people who love it. I fall somewhat in the middle actually with this book. I go closer to the love it side because I do think that there's so much to be delved into with this book, and I do think it's a fascinating book to discuss. But so part of the reason that motivated this book talk is actually the fact that I feel like you need historical context in order to go into this one, preferably. If you've already read it, it definitely doesn't hurt to go into the historical context at a later point in time, but it's definitely important to be aware of the historical context. And I do feel like the book dropped the ball a little bit on that, because it in no sense mentions the fact that this is a book that refers to real life events. So it doesn't give that guidance to its reader. And a lot of people have, for example, criticized certain things happening within this book as being cartoonish, as being so over the top, while they are actually representations of real life events that did definitely take place in that way. So if you want to dive into the Poppy War, I would definitely say stick around. I'm going to dive into the historical context after a brief plot summary now. So the premise for this book is we are looking at our main character, Rin. Rin is from the south of the Nikata Empire. She was orphaned during the Second Poppy War, and she's taken in by a family in the south of the Nikata Empire. They basically just treat her as some of free labor, and they just treat her horribly, and so she desperately wants to escape the situation, and one way in which she can do that is to get into Synagogue, which is a prestigious war academy in the north of the empire. In order for her to be able to get in there, she has to study a lot and pass the Kechu exam. But she does manages to do that, and so then the story sets off from there. From there, the book is amazingly split into two parts. The first part is taking place in the Synagogue Academy, and it's very much a academy setting book in which we are looking at training, and which we are looking at the problems of conflicts with other classmates and stuff like that, conflicts with teachers, and her trying to overcome that and come into her own. But around the midway point, the story shifts because war erupts with the enemy, the Muganese Empire, and so the different members of the academy are shipped off to different parts of the country in order to help reinforce the armies there and help answer the threat of this Muganese Empire. So this is basically the main plot of the story, but before I dive into the plots and the different themes being discussed more thoroughly, I will go into historical context. Now be wary that I do have a background in Chinese history, but I am by no means an expert. And I'm also not going to attempt to dive into more detail with these historic events, because I do think that it's important to have a base, but it is also a reimagining of history. So it's going to take this historical context, and it's going to play with that. There's a lot of this historic context will be reimagined with other players. For example, in this book we basically only have the Chinese or Nikata Empire and the Japanese or Muganese Empire, but in real life events there were definitely other players involved that we are basically leaving out or even like taking their part in these conflicts and giving them to the Mughal Empire, for example. So there are three main events that I feel have a huge part to play within this story. First of all are obviously the Opium Wars or the Poppy Wars. So the Opium Wars take place within the 19th century, and they are a conflict mainly between the British Empire and the Chinese Empire. They will be reinterpreted in here, but the main impact that this has on our story is the introduction of opium into China. So the British were the ones to introduce opium into China. In this book it will be the Mughals. And apart from just introducing this drug into China, their introduction of this drug led to a whole sort of like smuggle trade of the drug, because the Chinese were very much trying to control the importation of opium, and so the British were very much using like smuggle tactics in order to gain more of a market share within this growing market within the Chinese society. The introduction of opium had a devastating effect on Chinese society, because a lot of people in China got addicted to this drug and they sort of like wasted away, and it's very horrific to look at the impact that this had on Chinese society at the time. And we will also be looking at opium within this book. We will be also trying to reclaim opium a little bit within this book as well. Second event that had an impact on this story is the First Sino-Japanese War. This is a war between China and Japan, and so it is reimagined into the Poppy Wars within the historical context of this book. The First Sino-Japanese War is basically a war surrounding Korea and the influence over Korea. Korea was very much under the control of China at the beginning of the First Sino-Japanese War, but Japan, who was having a major cultural and economic resurgence, tried to exert more power over the region. At the end of this conflict, Korea became an independent nation, though it did have a lot of influence from Japan and it had a lot of ties with Japan at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. And other island nations such as Taiwan were also given over into the control of Japan at the end of this conflict. In the book we will see this represented in this Poppy Wars, in which China had this island nation of Spear, so the Nikkara Island. I'm going to be using them throughout interspersively, but the Nikkara Empire had this island nation of Spear that was under their control, and they very much used this population of Spear as their sort of warrior nation, and this island gets decimated during the First Sino-Japanese War. Now, current day events within this book. So in this book we are very much looking at the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Second Sino-Japanese War is a conflict that basically can be considered as like the Asian part of the Second World War. So we're very much looking at a conflict that will arise between Japan and China, and that will ultimately lead to the involvement of Japan into Second World War and the destruction of Japan by the Americans after they attacked Pearl Harbor. So the Second Sino-Japanese War is mainly a conflict that starts out at the end of the 1930s. So at this point Japan decides to invade China. They start by invading a large part of the province of Manchuria, and they make their way south, invading major cities such as the capital at the time, the capital of Nanjing. And the event taking place in Nanjing, which is referred to as the Massacre of Nanjing or the Rape of Nanjing, is going to be prominently featured within this book. If you've ever heard of people reading this book and you've heard of the infamous chapter 21 of this book, Chapter 21 is a representation of the horrors that took place in Nanjing during the Nanjing Massacre. And so be warned that there is going to be graphic violence, horrendous events taking place within that chapter. We are not seeing an actual portrayal of these events taking place, but we are very much taking stock of what has taken place there afterwards. So we're very much entering into Nanjing, let's call it like that, after this event has taken place. So this is very much the key feature in this book, and so it's very much not a cartoonish portrayal, it's very much what happened in real life. Now, what happened during the Rape of Nanjing, I won't go into details or anything like that, but so a lot of horrendous events took place, a lot of people were killed, a lot of innocents were killed. So the Japanese were very much concerned with Chinese civilians being being spies, being dressed up as pure civilians, but actually being soldiers in disguise. So a lot of people were killed in their search for these disguised soldiers, but a lot of these people were actually just innocents. It is estimated that some 300,000 civilians were killed. Japanese estimates themselves vary from like 100,000 to 200,000 casualties. But worldwide, it's mostly established that 300,000 casualties were the result of this event in the Second Sino-Japanese War. So the Japanese, apart from invading into China, they also invaded into Burma, and then later on they also attacked Pearl Harbor, as I also already referred to, and their involvement in the attack on Pearl Harbor is what resulted into the Americans taking revenge by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, thus ending Japan's involvement in the Second World War. Now, another part of the Second Sino-Japanese War that is definitely being portrayed and referred to within this book is the type of warfare that was being waged. So, based on the fact that the Japanese were very successful of their invasion in China, you could think that they have the bigger army, but that was actually not the case. They were actually a smaller force, but they resulted a lot to the use of biochemical weapons. So they had a lot of poison gas, for example, that they were using throughout. They would also resort to the use of fleas that were infected by plagues, and they would unleash these fleas onto cities so that they would have major casualties within the cities. They would also do medical experimentation on prisoners in the province of Manchuria, and all of those things are referred to within this book. You don't necessarily see all of them taking place, some of them are just being plotted within this book, but all of them are being referred to within this book as well. The Chinese on their part will start to develop the sort of use of suicide bombers, which is not being referred to, I don't think so at least, that we are referring to them in this book, but I do assume that we're going to see this develop a little bit in the sequel to this book, because as far as I'm aware, we are going to be looking at the rise of Mao, more or less, within the second book of this series. And so I do know that when the Communist Party was making their advance, was making their rebellion, they resorted a lot to sort of guerrilla warfare, and so we're probably going to see a lot of that take place within the second book. Anything else historically that I need to talk to you guys about? I think I've delved into the main elements for these three events that I've talked about. There is more in the historical context of Chinese-Japanese relationships, or just the Chinese history in general, that go into this book. For example, before the Second Sino-Japanese War, there had been troubles within the Chinese Empire itself, and so they had basically just gotten back together, let's call it like that. The Chinese emperor had just been like re-established, and so this also takes place at the beginning of this also is in the background of the beginning of this book. Because of that like recent unification, the empire was also a lot weaker than it could have been to withstand the Japanese invasion. Another thing which is not going to be a problem for most people, but if you have studied Mandarin Chinese, there are different ways in which the Chinese script can be transcribed into Western script, and this one uses American transcription. So if you have learned Pinyin, this might be somewhat difficult for you. I found myself getting very distracted with it in the beginning, very much trying to figure out like how would you pronounce that name? What is the like Pinyin equivalent for this transcription? When I switched to the audiobook, that's when that problem disappeared from me, and I was finally able to fully immerse myself into this world. But so enough about the historical context, let's dive into the story itself. So as I said, the story is very much divided into two parts. So in the first part we are looking at Rin trying to get into the academy, getting into the academy and her training there. What is very much at the forefront of this is this sort of like discriminatory attitudes that the Northerners have towards Southerners within the Nikkara Empire. So Rin is from the southern regions. She also has a darker skin than people in the north have. And people within the Synagogue Academy will definitely let her know how they feel about her. They will definitely consider her as lower, as beneath them. And they will also consider that she doesn't really have a place there, because within the north there's huge competition to get into Sinagard. There's so many people studying all of their lives to try and get into Sinagard, and they very much consider that people in the south have it easy to get into Sinagard because from every province the highest student gets in. So if you're coming from a province where not a whole lot of people have the means or the levels of education to get into Sinagard, so in their opinion Rin had it easy to get into Sinagard. Apart from that, they also consider that in the south they have some backward belief systems, though throughout the book we will definitely examine some of these southern superstitions about shamans and shamanic powers and see that there's probably a little bit more truth to these superstitions than what was previously believed. Her teachers also at times will have a discriminatory attitudes towards people in the south. They very much consider the people in the south to be kind of just like along for the ride, to be taking advantage of this opportunity. And so one teacher in particular will not give her the opportunity she deserves. And while she is starting with a backlog because she hasn't had the opportunities to be exposed to certain crafts such as martial arts as the others have, she is starting with a backlog, and her teacher will also very much not be willing to understand that she's coming from a sort of different background where this is concerned. So this first part very much looks at these sort of discriminatory acts and very much looks at Rin's reaction to them and Rin's anger when it comes to these instances. So she is very much trying very hard to prove herself worthy, to prove that she does belong there, that she is worthy, and that she can do whatever she sets out to do. And throughout this we see her develop a sort of very unhealthy relationship to approval, to praise, to esteem. It has been there all along, so she has been self-harming from the get-go, but we definitely see this elevate throughout this first part and then into the second one. So as I already indicated, self-harm is a trigger warning for this book. So we see this from the very get-go. In the first chapter of this book we see Rin trying to get into Sinagard Academy by studying for state exams for the Kutju, and a way in which she is making herself study more is by burning her hands whenever she falls asleep so that she wakes up again and has more time to study. And so this is one instance of self-harm, but there's definitely more and more horrendous ones coming actually already shortly after this instance within the book. So Rin is very much a character that has the belief of the end justifies the means, and where we see this on an individual level in the beginning of the book, this will take on higher levels in the second part of the book and probably throughout this series. So R.F. Kuang has indicated that in this trilogy she wanted to explore how does one become a Mao Zedong, how does one become a dictator. So be wary that we are not going to, some people fall in love with Rin, but it's not necessarily the intention for you to like Rin, to like her choices, to condone her choices. So she will be making some very bad ones throughout this book, and it starts off with these individual choices she makes in the beginning, in which she's very much equating pain to success because she hurts herself, but as a result she will be able to achieve her goal. And so she's very much learning that pain means nothing. It doesn't matter that she's in temporary pain, that she has to sacrifice something because she will gain something as a result, which will be the basis of a very toxic sort of reasoning pattern that she will develop later on. This first part of the novel also sees our first exploration of shamanic power. So I've also already referred to it earlier that we are going to be reclaiming the poppy plant within this book. So the poppy plant, part of the poppy plant, and don't ask me which part, is being used to make opium, to make the drug, but the use of another part of this plant can be used to commune with the gods. And Rin will be educated to use this skill. And so we're very much looking at a reclaiming of this plant that has been associated with this destructive drug and looking at a positive way in which to use this. However, in the second part of the book we will also see how this can become very destructive in itself as well. Moving on to the second part of this book. So we've established Rin in this first part as a character who is willing to go all the way in order to gain success, who is trying to find her way, her place within this world. And when we are somewhat reaching a sort of status quo, her whole world gets shook up because we end up in a conflict with the Muganese Empire. From one moment into the other we are under attack and she is thrust into the world of warfare. Now this is a very abrupt shift and it very much makes the book feel disjointed, but I also definitely feel that it is realistic to have this take place like that. It is realistic to have people trained to become soldiers who have to abandon their training way too early because a conflict arises and they just need the manpower, and so these people are thrust into these dangerous situations without them necessarily being ready for it. And so while that creates these sort of very two different parts of the book, it is definitely something that takes place and that is realistic in that sense. But so in this second part we're going to very much have a shift of thematic, which is normal as well, because within a setting of war there are definitely other priorities taking place. You know, she will no longer have those priorities of like trying to prove herself as a southerner, because whether she's a southerner or a northerner all of a sudden doesn't matter anymore. All of a sudden survival is all that matters, and so it's very much looking at her interacting with these cruelties of war, and she's going to become hardened through these experiences, and she's going to become more extreme in her beliefs throughout this second part. Because the first time that she's introduced to a Muganese soldier, that the realization that she comes to is that actually the Muganese look very much like northern soldiers from the Nikara Empire. So at first she doesn't really see the enemy as monsters or anything like that. She's just struck by how much they look alike. But then later on in the book, through watching these horrible events and these horrible acts of cruelty on the side of the Muganese, on the Nikara people, she will definitely become radicalized and come to see them as monsters, and come to see that no matter what they enact upon them, they've deserved it, and they must be stopped at all costs. Part of what I didn't necessarily like about that was that radicalization. I understand that this is what happens, but I definitely felt like it lacked a little bit of nuance there. I also felt like she was swept away a little bit too easily by one of the characters that she kind of starts to consider as her role model, and I definitely didn't really understand the sort of like romantic attraction happening there. Like I think it's kind of implied that there's a romance there, but I definitely didn't feel any sort of chemistry between these two neither, and I didn't understand why she was so swept into his belief system and why she was very much like following his reasoning. I mean, I understand it to an effect, but I think that it could have been worked out a little bit better, that part of the book. What I also didn't necessarily like is within the second part, people are being thrown into different parts of the army, and she is given to a like sort of elite force called the Psych. Now in normal times, Psychs are just like assassins sent out to kill people, and so now these Psychs are being used within the sort of framework of the army, and I guess that they're supposed to be a sort of guerrilla warfare part to the army. It's probably even mentioned within the book. But so they are very much separate from the normal army structure, and I didn't necessarily like that sort of dynamic that you then get between the army and this group. But apart from that, like that's just like personal preference stuff, because I definitely know that a whole lot of people did enjoy that. Within this second part, we're very much looking at Rin and her shamanic powers, and we're very much giving them a new direction. Within this first part, when she was being educated within the shamanic powers, there was very much her mentor there to guide her, and her mentor very much had a sort of emphasis on the sort of tradition aspect to these powers, emphasis on the way in which this power had been passed down through generations, and the sort of glorification of this power. But he very much was opposed to her using these powers to lash out, to take her feelings out on others. And in the second part, we're very much seeing her get a new mentor figure, and this mentor figure has the opposite belief system. He very much feels that they should be using these powers, that they need to use these powers to quell the invasion of the Muganese. So I won't go too deep into this second part just because of spoilers, but this is very much a part in which we're going to be looking at the cruelties of wars and the response to her, you know, the radicalization that I've referred to, the deeper drive into her shamanic powers, the way in which she gets lost in those powers. And so as a final thing that we discuss, I want to kind of look at this whole idea of opium again a little bit. So as I said, we are reclaiming part of the destructive power of the poppy plant by using it as a weapon to reach out to the gods and to have the gods act through them. But we very much also see the destructiveness of that part of the poppy plant, of that usage of the poppy plants, because we very much see that sometimes these shamans kind of get lost in their power. The power kind of takes over, the god takes over. And apart from that, the intensity of this connection to the gods also means that from time to time they are having difficulty switching things off, and they will actually resort to opium as a way to null their feelings, to kind of escape reality. So we're seeing how they're reclaiming this poppy plant as a weapon, but how that weapon is also slowly destroying them from the inside. But so overall, I think that there's so much to discuss here. I have gone through the major things that I wanted to discuss with this book, but there's definitely some stuff that I don't go into because of spoilers, and there's definitely a lot more that I'm probably just not actively thinking about now that I would also definitely like to discuss. But so it's a very interesting one, I think, in terms of it's got so much discussion material to it, and there's so much possibility for different stances on these things. For example, I've told you that I don't agree with the decisions that she makes within this story, and I definitely know that you can make the opposite argument. You could see why she's making these choices, and you could understand and condone that. I personally don't, but I can understand that people do. And so there's so much to be delved into with this book. In terms of enjoyment, I will say that I was a little bit disappointed with this one because it is Chinese-inspired fantasy. I was expecting to love it because it is such harsh representation of war. I was expecting to love it, and altogether I was a little bit disappointed, and that has to do with what I said before, that I personally didn't really get why she was getting carried away by this new mentor figure in the second part of the book, and I also don't necessarily like how that first mentor is handled. I think that happens a lot in fantasy, where you have a wise older mentor figure who is telling somebody not to do something but not explaining why they shouldn't do that, which then drives that person to do it altogether and then to experience the consequences then for themselves. And so yeah, I was kind of tired of seeing that happen. I was kind of annoyed with that taking place, but all in all, I do definitely love this book. I think I gave it a 4-star rating in the end. But so yeah, that's going to be it for me and this book. Definitely let me know down below if you've read this book, what you thought of it, if you want to discuss certain things. And there's definitely so much more to explore, like the character of the Chime, which I thought was such an interesting folklore elements to add to this book. And yeah, I will be diving into the second one as soon as possible, as soon as I find a spot in my reading schedule for it. And I'm very much looking forward to see what other real life events we're going to be seeing in the second one. But so yeah, see you guys for the next one.